Howdy, I'm Arthur Falls. Welcome to Aotearoa Tomorrow. Are local councils contributing to the housing crisis? If so, how? And more importantly, is there a solution that we can find to this problem in public policy? Eric Crampton has some answers for us. He's an economist at a think tank called the New Zealand Initiative. What we learn about is the sheer incapacitating pressure that councils have been put under due to debt restrictions and limited central government support. This makes it harder to build infrastructure and encourages councils to restrict local development. It turns out we used to run councils very differently, and as usual, a solution to problems of the present can be found in the past. Uncovering the solution takes us on a journey through history and the complex world of local government. This interview helped me understand why things are the way they are in a way that never would have been possible without such a knowledgeable person sitting down to patiently explain it all. Eric is a fantastic communicator, and this episode was an absolute treat to produce, as I'm sure you'll enjoy listening to it as much as I enjoyed creating it. And with us today is Eric Crampton, the chief economist of the New Zealand Initiative. Thanks so much for joining us, Eric.
Thanks for having me.
So, the New Zealand Initiative is a think tank that works to advise the government on public policy. Now, there's kind of a lot in there, and I think certainly myself, before I actually knew about it was when I learned about the New Zealand Initiative that I actually came to understand what a think tank actually was. So I guess we've got three things here that we can probably get skilled up on. Maybe you could tell us a bit about yourself, a bit about the New Zealand Initiative, and then also a little bit about what the New Zealand Initiative does and what a think tank is.
Sure. So I guess I'll start with me and then get to the initiative if that makes sense. I'm originally a farm boy from southern Manitoba, went to grad school in the United States, and then got an academic posting at the University of Canterbury. So I was there an economist for about 12 years before shifting over to a think tank. Oliver had wanted me to come on up, and it was after the Christchurch earthquakes, so life in Christchurch was less fun, and I enjoyed having a policy focus anyway. At a think tank, you focus a little bit more on policy-relevant questions rather than more esoteric matters, and that was in line with what I was wanting to do. The initiative is the successor organization to two prior think tanks, the New Zealand Institute and the New Zealand Business Roundtable. They merged in 2012, and the initiative was formed out of that. So a think tank, well, it has a bunch of researchers on staff generally who think about public policy issues. Internationally, they're pretty common. In New Zealand, not quite so much. We're a combination that's a little unique internationally. It's a combination of a business membership organization and a think tank. So that means that business members provide an annual subscription fee that covers all of our costs, that pays the bills for us. But we are independent, we set our own research direction, we choose the public policy topics that we think are most important, where we can make a difference. You'd given a bit of an intro that we advise government. Well, we kind of advise more broadly than that. So if government wants to listen to us, we are more than happy to talk with them or to the opposition. Often you have more fruitful discussions with parties before they form government than you do after they form government, because then they've got ministries providing all kinds of advice, and sometimes their advice is okay, sometimes not so much. More fundamentally, though, we've had a sort of public outreach role where one of our jobs, as we see it, is trying to communicate good policy. So figure out what's broken, how to fix it, and then try and make it politically possible for better policy to be chosen. So often one of the binding constraints against good policy being implemented is a lack of public understanding of it. Lack of rehearsal of the arguments around it. People don't know what the basic problem is, and if you don't have good problem definition, it's really hard to get good policy solutions. So we do a lot of work in fairly public-facing reports. They might look a little bit wonky for some folks, but they're kind of a bridge between academic work and the broader public. So academic research articles tend to get read by almost nobody. Our job, as we've seen it, is to read through that academic literature on public policy questions that matter for New Zealand, translate it into form that is more readily accessible by politicians and the public, and then try and get the arguments out there so people understand them.
Immediately, this raises a question in my mind, and that is, if you're funded by business, does that in some way color your, I guess, your perspective as it relates to public policy? As in, are you more pro-business and less pro-labor, shall we say?
I guess it depends what you mean by pro-business. So we are anti-rent seeking, if that's one way of putting it. I'm a public choice economist. Rent seeking is about one of the nastiest insults that you can ever levy if you're an economist. So a rent seeker is someone who tries to lobby government for basically transfers or regulatory privileges that are bad for the country as a whole, but good for that business or good for that particular interest group. We're not in that business. We steer away from that. We try to encourage that our business members stay away from that, and that public policy more generally doesn't go down that kind of a route. So it would be fair to say that we are generally sympathetic to the role of markets in the economy, that we think in general markets tend to work better than a lot of the alternatives. But there's a good piece by Harold Demsetz 60 years ago now where he argued that you need to be doing what we call comparative institutional analysis. The idea there is, well, markets can fail and have problems, but the same holds true for policy. And in any case-by-case evaluation, you have to figure out what's going to suck least. Is it that some market failure is going to lead to dreadful outcomes, or would you get even worse outcomes by letting politicians and bureaucrats in there to try and make things better? Because often they wind up making things worse instead. So markets can fail, politics fails as well. Try to figure out what sucks least and how policy can best respond to what failures there really are out there.
Now, the reason that I got in touch is I wanted to find someone who could explain to me the role that local councils are playing in the housing crisis. The reason that I got in touch with you guys is that on your website, it claims A, that you introduced the concept of localism into New Zealand politics, and B, you presented to National the idea of infrastructure bonds. And my understanding of that policy was that a local council could issue bonds to fund the development of regional infrastructure, and that would pay for people to have sewage and water and power hooking up to their houses as they developed in green fields areas where there hadn't been residential development before.
Sure. So I guess I'll step back a little bit and then bring it back over into housing. So that you might have noticed a bit of a tension in the introduction that you there made, that we're fans of localism, but we also think that local government is behind some of the screw-ups in housing. So how do those fit together? Fundamentally, as we see it, there are very poor incentives facing local councils. As things stand, if a council enables a lot of development, so enables more housing, more business zoning for more businesses, more commercial office towers, more industrial space, anything like that, well, council, for its trouble, gets a very slight increase in its ratings base. That means that it's got a broader range of people and businesses across whom it can apportion its budget, but it doesn't really see much of a budget boost out of that, right? So the way that we handle things here in local government, council decides how much they want to spend on stuff and then divvies that amount up across its ratings base, whether it's businesses, households, industrial, whatever. Now, that gives them a pretty weak incentive to want to pursue things that enable more growth. They get a slight increase in their ratings base. That means that over the next several decades, they get a little bit more money than they otherwise might have. But what do they get in exchange for that? They get a giant hassle right up front. They have infrastructure demands to service the new residences or new businesses that they cannot apportion over time because they're hitting up against their debt limits. They have a pile of NIMBYs that don't really like change and don't want anything built next to them. If council wants to somehow pay for the infrastructure that would support growth, the costs of that fall across the entire rating space. Everybody's rates go up to be able to cover the cost of the infrastructure serving a new community or a new subdivision or upzoning downtown. Central government does really well when councils enable growth. They get extra income tax revenue, they get extra company tax revenue, they get extra GST. So, of course, you wind up in this spot where they're at loggerheads. Central government wants councils to enable more housing and more growth and sets liberal immigration policy, which we also support. But councils can't deal with it. So they've used their zoning and consenting functions to protect their balance sheets against the cost that they perceive as coming with enabling growth. And you can completely understand why. So fixing that fundamentally requires changing the incentives that councils face so that they can share in the benefits that central government gets if councils take an enabling approach for growth rather than a hindering approach, and giving councils the tools to be able to fund and finance the infrastructure that's necessary to support it. Now, it's not just me saying this. We've come to reasonable cross-party agreement on sort of that problem diagnosis. This wasn't the case when I first moved to New Zealand, and it wasn't the case even 10 years ago. So for decades, we've had not nearly enough building to keep up with demand for housing. Getting out of that mess is going to take a very long time. We have started slowly coming out of it, in part because of the Auckland Unitary Plan. We can come back to that, but also some nice parts from Labour's urban growth agenda.
So whenever I think about councils and construction, I always think about these impossible inspections that have to take place at various times in the construction process. And I have a few friends who are builders, and the most important thing they tell you is if you can avoid council inspections, do it. And if you don't have to tell the council you're building it, just don't tell them. If you think you can get away with it, or if you can change the design of your building or your project so that they don't have to know. And it makes me think if some of the consenting process is actually pushing a lot of our construction industry, certainly small construction industry, into a kind of grey market.
Well, it would be risky to go that way if it's something that could potentially be viewed afterwards as having needed a consent, because, well, they probably won't notice until you go to sell your property, but your conveyancing lawyers are going to check whether everything that's in there is being consented, and you could be setting yourself up for some horrible costs down the track. But there's a reason that councils are this way, right? So MB had commissioned some work a few years ago. It was Saperi that undertook the work, and they showed that. Now, I'm going from memory on the numbers, but it's going to be ballpark right here. I think it was 47 or 48% of cases in which there was a legal dispute after a build happened about a building failure. So something went wrong. So either the wrong material was used, or the building wound up leaky later on, or something. There's some dispute about the quality of the work that resulted in damages. In 47 or 48% of the cases where that had happened, local council wound up being 100% responsible for all of the costs that were awarded. Because what happens, right? They're under joint and several responsibility, or joint and several liability with all of the construction companies. You get a set of construction companies, if it's kind of small-time ones, they're numbered companies that roll over every few years. By the time a defect is found or a leaky building problem has emerged, those companies are gone. The only one that's left standing is council. And that's why about 47, 48% of the time, council end up having to pay 100% of the cost. So if council is a real pain in permitting your house, what's the harm to council? Like, I can't think of any. But if they aren't quite diligent enough, they risk being on the hook for 100% of all of the costs down the track. Because it's a free option for somebody to just sue council down the track, because council's the one that signed off on it. They're to blame.
It sounds to me like council's really getting squeezed by all of these, essentially everything that has anything to do with building new properties and expanding their ability to house a larger residential base.
Well, yeah, every incentive facing councils is don't allow more housing. They get squeezed by central government response to that, seeing the ways that councils have tried to block growth, and then they implement new national policy statements saying, well, from now on, councils are forbidden from doing this thing that has blocked growth, or that thing that has blocked growth. But if the underlying incentives facing councils have not changed, they will just find another way to block growth. Like, it's not going to help you that much. It's like if you got kids and you tell them the one specific thing they're no longer allowed to do, they'll just come up with something else that's adjacent to it, right? It's old wine in new bottles, or sometimes I'd liken it to a balloon, squeezing on a balloon. It just bubbles out someplace else. So the ways that Labour government had come up with for trying to block councils from blocking growth, two pretty good pieces of legislation. So we had the National Policy Statement on Urban Development, which requires that council plans enable zoning of at least 6 stories within walking distance of mass transit. And like that totally makes sense, right? You want to enable more development in places where people want to live, where it's easily serviced. They also set a rule, the medium density residential standards, which say that, well, basically, in most of the country, a residential property section can be transformed from single house to up to 3 houses of up to 3 stories to enable more development, kind of broad-based across everywhere. But so long as councils are still facing these problems, they're going to find other ways of blocking things. So in Auckland, they still have fairly expansive character areas. You still have view shafts that block development, and we can talk more about those. If you'd not heard the term view shaft before, they're just a nightmare. I hadn't heard of them before I moved to New Zealand. It's just insane. In Wellington, they've seemed to be on a tear on designating more properties as being heritage listed, so that not Heritage New Zealand, the great big heritage designations, but the minor council designation. If you've got it as a designated heritage house, then that property might not be subject to the medium density rules. And in Christchurch, they seem to be ignoring those rules entirely, and we'll see what central government does about that.
When you say view corridors, I think I can guess what this is, and that's essentially that if there's a nice view, no one's allowed to block it.
Yeah, so the most expensive of these is view shaft E10, as far as anybody's been able to tell when they've tallied these things up. So yeah, they're numbered. So Auckland has these view shaft overlays, and you can go to these websites where you see the overlay of the different view shafts and what their effects are on different properties. But view shaft E10 is fun. That's the one where, if you go back in New Zealand's history, the Auckland Harbour Bridge used to be tolled, which made a ton of sense, right? That was from an era where you set debt to cover the cost of the infrastructure. The debt gets paid off over decades by the users of the infrastructure, and well, then they retired the user charge once the debt was paid off. Pretty nice. But there was a toll booth for the Auckland Harbour Bridge, and they wanted to make sure that as people slowed down to pay their toll at the Auckland Harbour Bridge, they could keep a view of one of these mountains. Okay? Well, what that meant is that, like, a good chunk of Auckland downtown in this zone, it's forbidden from having higher height limits. And those height limits get more and more binding as you get closer to the mountain, because that blocks more views. And it was at least $1 billion was the cost of view shaft E10 when they'd figured out, okay, here's how many more apartments and commercial floors have been blocked by view shaft E10. Okay, well, that's costing about $1 billion. And nobody even notices this view anymore because you're just zipping by on the Harbour Bridge. It's not like you're stopping to pay a toll. And even if you were stopping to pay a toll, does it make sense to lose $1 billion worth of development for sake of it? Like, think about it.
So what was the big change that happened in Auckland that started to make it easier to develop?
Auckland has started to bend the curve on rents, but that traces back to the Auckland Unitary Plan. So the prior national government had forced the Auckland councils to amalgamate into a unitary authority. So instead of having a lot of different little councils, they were merged into a unitary authority. Now, the stated reason for this had nothing to do with housing. That it was all about perceived efficiencies, where if you amalgamate all of these councils, you need fewer council officials because you can amalgamate back-end offices. You've got like one payroll department, one HR department, instead of having lots of little ones. And they figured they were going to get great efficiencies out of this. I don't think anybody believes that those efficiencies panned out. But what did come of it was the Auckland Unitary Plan. So the Auckland Unitary Plan allowed a lot more development than had been allowed in the plans of the prior constituent councils, which resulted in a lot more building. So rents haven't gone up in Auckland by as much as they otherwise would have, because council wound up with a far more liberal zoning plan. You will get continue more of that with the National Policy Statement on Urban Development, requiring more upzoning near mass transit. You'll get more of it again with the medium density rules, so long as those aren't pulled back from by an incoming national government in the 75 to 80% chance that that's what we get after the election, or at least according to the betting markets. I follow the betting markets on this rather than the polls. So long as they don't pull away too substantially from the MDRS rules, you will see a continuation of the decline in rents relative to a counterfactual. But unfortunately, what we haven't had is more enabled expansion at city fringes. So you really need to let cities grow both up and out if you want them to be affordable. If you allow up without allowing out, then like it's great, you get a lot more apartments, you get more townhouses, but the underlying land prices are way more expensive than they need to be. If you get infrastructure funding and financing all completely done properly, so it all loads onto the end user, well, then there shouldn't be any difference in those costs. If there's a little bit of free infrastructure that's provided, you might see a higher price within the zone, just reflecting that. But right now in Auckland, if you're at the edge of Auckland, a square meter of land that's zoned urban costs $1,270 more than a square meter of land that's zoned rural just on the other side, after taking account the land development cost. That means that land at the fringes is artificially constrained by zoning. That we've got too little land that is zoned for more intensive use, that bids up the price of land that is zoned for appropriate use, and if you've boosted the price at the fringe, that bids up the price everywhere else in town.
It's important, I think, to note then that also these heritage listed areas, they are also reducing supply of of land that could be redeveloped or densified.
Absolutely. Urban econ types in New Zealand call it Auckland's ring of shame, right? So you've got this ring of inner subdivisions where lots of people would love to be able to live, but it is forbidden to turn them into more intensive use. It's very frustrating, right? Because the infrastructure cost would be a little bit lower there than elsewhere. Obviously, lots of people want to be able to live there, and it's not like an upzoning would force anybody to sell their house. You only turn it into a set of townhouses or apartments if the owner of the property wants that to happen, right? So they're getting between willing buyers and willing sellers there.
You mentioned before that Labor had introduced a law that said you needed to enable development up to 6 stories within a certain range of mass transit.
Yep.
So who decides where mass transit goes?
That's kind of a fun two-part question. One is who decides where mass transit goes, and two, what counts as mass transit in the first place, right? So here in Wellington, there were scraps about whether the Johnsonville train line would count as mass transit or not. On the plus side, arguing in favor of it being mass transit is, well, it's obviously a rail line. It's frequently serviced at rush hour. There's empty cars even at rush hour. It could handle more people, and it's faster than driving. Okay. On the anti side, the track is narrow. It can't be double tracked because of the tunnels and the gorges. It would make it nearly impossible to increase the frequency of travel because trains have to meet and then sit at a station to wait for the other one to pass because there aren't 2 lines. Anyway, I'm not sure it's been fully settled whether or not the Johnsonville line gets to count as mass transit. A busway would count as mass transit, but is a bus stop? Depends on the frequency of the bus, I suppose. Rail would, but there's still scraps about whether rail is going to happen or not in Auckland. That all gets pretty complicated and above my pay grade. I don't know what winds up being counted as it. And really, it all should be kind of a joint decision where if a rapid transit line is going to be designated as such for the national policy statement purposes, you would want everything along there to be upzoned, and some of the extra value that's provided to that land by its getting that mass transit service should be used to fund the construction of the thing. So I'll look across to Japan very briefly. Japan has a fantastic rail system, right? And one of the reasons that it has a fantastic rail system is that the rail company owns land around it. And if there's a spot where they think there's a lot of development potential, they subdivide, they sell off the lots, and they use the money to build the train stations, right? So that's a way of having what you'd call value capture. Because the railway line owns the land, they're able to capture the value from upzoning and put that towards the infrastructure that makes the development possible in the first place. So it all ties together. If you're thinking about Auckland Light Rail or something like that, you could have a charge on the properties that are serviced by the line because they will increase in value because of the opportunity to both upzone and because of the increased amenity value from being adjacent to mass transit. Pay that over time as a special levy, an increased levy. Have that money go into paying off the debt that's used to fund the infrastructure that provides the mass transit. These really could be joint decisions rather than trying to think about them piecemeal.
So this idea of getting the user to pay is very much up your alley because this is a market-based approach to paying for infrastructure. And you mentioned this as well about getting the actual developers to pay for the infrastructure that's used to service subdivisions on the edge of town, right?
Yep.
Does this have something to do with the infrastructure bonds that you developed with the national government?
Well, I'll just a mild correction on that, or a slight reframing. We have suggested in revenue bonds for infrastructure funding and financing. We didn't really develop that with the national government, though. It's something that we've had an interest in. I've done recent work on it. We pitched it broadly. Anybody that wants to pick it up, we're happy to talk with them about that idea. And it isn't antithetical at all to what Labor's put up. So Minister Twyford progressed the infrastructure funding and financing legislation, which attempts to get in that direction. It's just officials had a tough time making it workable. We've suggested a few things that might make it a lot more workable and more generally applicable. So the basic idea there, it isn't just that like beneficiary pays is some like market ideal or something. It just works, right? So if you look back to the period in which New Zealand was able to get a lot more stuff built, it was the era in which you had that kind of debt financing mechanism that made sure that people who aren't benefiting from a project aren't stuck trying to pay for it. Because if you run things that way, you get a lot more opposition to stuff, right? There's NIMBYs and there's bananas, right? So NIMBYs say, don't build anything next door to me. Bananas say, build absolutely nowhere near anybody. All right. One reason that you might get bananas is if you try and spread the infrastructure costs for a new development or for a new apartment tower or whatever across the entire community rather than to the beneficiaries of that infrastructure. So we're stuck now in a spot where councils try and spread those costs over a short period of time across a wide base of users, which generates kind of generalized hostility to the debt in the first place and the charges that are required to pay for it. And it means that you have that makes it harder to roll that debt out, and it makes it easier to put up projects that actually don't make sense, right? Because if I expect that somebody else is going to be paying for the thing that benefits my neighborhood, and I'm only bearing a small portion of the cost, of course I'll think it's a wonderful idea. So as simple example, recently, again, I'll give a Wellington example, even though we're far from being the population base, but it's where I live and it's the examples that I know, right? I live in Candela, again, one of the more affluent communities. So Wellington Council is paying for an upgrade to our swimming pool. So we've got this outdoor swimming pool that isn't heated, it's cold, it could use an upgrade. But Johnsonville, which is just another 3 minutes drive down the road or a 20-minute, half-hour walk, depending on your walking speed, there's a wonderful swimming pool right there, okay? The local councillor lobbied to get Wellington Council money to pay for the outdoor swimming pool that's serving like the richest part of town. Well, that's just dumb. We could have paid for that ourselves. Like, why are poor people in other parts of the city paying for the swimming pool in Candela? Well, we've abandoned the kind of principle that users should pay for their kit.
When did this change? When did we stop the user pays model? And can we point the finger at anyone just for fun?
Oh, sure. It was a few changes. So coming out of the reforms of the 1980s, there were reforms to local government where central government looked out at the universe of local government and just saw mass confusion. So that was the era where you had hundreds of little local boards that were all doing little local things. And they're all special purpose boards. You'd have like rabbit boards that were established in rural communities to help eliminate rabbits. You'd have flood and drainage boards that's main job was to try and keep the rivers from flooding onto adjacent properties, building dikes and weirs and flood works. All kinds of these little boards. And from central government's perspective, that is something that could be fixed with more amalgamation. Let's turn those all into being just part of local council. Well, that's great, except those local boards were one of the ways that local communities organized to provide infrastructure works that were beneficial to the community. So those kinds of boards had ability to put up debt. So long as the affected ratepayers agreed to the debt by a supermajority vote, they could have a special levy on their properties to fund the debt, or to finance the debt that funded the works. So you had this nice arrangement where locals, by a supermajority vote, could simultaneously agree to a project that they saw as beneficial, agree to the debt that would fund it, and agree to the special levy on their properties that would finance it. That meant that ratepayers were authorizing it, so they knew that it was something that they thought was going to be a good idea. It wasn't sort of some white elephant project that council is pitching or something that wouldn't really make sense for them. Local communities were coming up with these things and were able to self-organize for it. The Bassett reforms to local government got rid of most of these boards and just amalgamated them all into local councils.
What year was that? What government was that?
So that would have been around 91. So it was the changes that came in, the end of the last bit of the Labour government there and the start of the next national one.
Yeah.
So they got rid of those bits of local council. Then there was another piece of legislation that came in, I think it was in 1995, that said that councils should not even be trying to make beneficiaries pay for stuff, that they should be trying to spread the costs over the whole community. Now, there can be good equity reasons for wanting burdens to be shared, or like you can imagine cases where, say, that one part of the town is just not affluent enough to be able to afford works that everybody thinks are necessary for a decent standard within the town. Spreading the cost of some of that can make sense. One better way of spreading those costs, though, is through central government income redistribution policy rather than trying to spread the cost of the infrastructure within councils. It meant that over time, we would run into these limits. At first, you didn't have big problems out of it because councils still had a lot of balance sheet capacity. They could take on general obligation debt to cover the cost of works that they considered important. But you lost the ratepayer authorization mechanism. So we no longer had the principle that councils had to go back to their ratepayers for a ballot for support for taking on debt for a substantial project. That meant that kind of nice sounding things whose business cases might not quite stack up as much had an easier time getting through, and especially if it's stuff you can cut a ribbon for. It's hard to cut a ribbon on necessary improvements to sewerage, maintenance of the pipes, that kind of thing. Instead, you get flashy convention centers and stadiums and the like. So we saw a running down of some of the underlying infrastructure because it's always easy to siphon depreciation money out of the balance sheets over into other projects, where you couldn't have done that as easily with debt finance projects because you've got annual debt payments that you have to make, and that's what's paying for the infrastructure. And covenants on that debt can require that the owner of it maintain the infrastructure. Otherwise, you're going to lose the ability to keep levying payments that are based on the infrastructure. So those together broke what had been important in enabling infrastructure funding and financing for works that communities thought were important. It took a long time for councils' balance sheets to load up with other kinds of nonsense, so they wound up having trouble funding and financing new infrastructure. But once we got to that point, it became effectively impossible for councils to fund major works. So councils borrow through the Local Government Financing Authority, and the LGFA is great. They help in marketing the debt. They make sure the debt kind of stacks up. They help councils in issuing debt. But one of the triggers that they put in there to make it easier to market the debt and maintain the ratings of it is that the debt to revenue limit for a council can't exceed a threshold. Now, councils take that as kind of like a hard and fast rule. It's more of a softer constraint. Councils could issue more debt if they wanted to, but it'd be kind of subordinate. They'd have another worse rating on that additional debt. And councils haven't really gone that way. And ratepayers have been reluctant to take on more debt more generally because with the loss of ratepayer authorization, how do you know that you're not just voting for people who will spend money on dumb stuff, right? Because you can't constrain them once the debt's been issued. They've got a whole pile of money. So if a council's at its debt limit at, like, say, 280%, which has been kind of normal recently, that effectively means that you have to pay off a new infrastructure work within 3 years, which just can't really be done reasonably on a user pays basis. So just to make it really, really obvious, imagine that a council just comes in and they've got nothing and they want to take on debt for some new infrastructure project. Well, if the debt that they have can't exceed 280% of their annual revenues, and let's imagine that the only revenue they get is the revenue that comes because they've facilitated this piece of infrastructure work, whether it's new rates because they've got a new subdivision that's gone in or a new apartment tower that's gone up, or it's user charges or whatever. If the debt can't exceed 280% of the revenues, well, you have to make up the entire amount of the debt within 2.8 years, right?
Oh, right. So as you say this, because my eyes sort of glaze over when I hear all these numbers, but now that you're saying, I see the catch. You've got to be turning, this becomes almost profit driven, and the profit demands are extremely high.
Well, that's why special ratings areas don't really work anymore. So council still can set special purpose ratings areas, but because they don't have ring-fenced debt and it's all general obligation debt, well, if you tried to pay off the infrastructure just through that special rate, you're effectively telling everybody in that area that they've got 3 years to pay the whole thing off. It's like trying to pay off your house in 3 years. Like, nobody could do that. Like, maybe someone like crazy rich people could do that. I couldn't do that. We've got a long time left on our mortgage, but it's nuts that infrastructure is going to last longer than a house generally, but you're trying to pay it off over a much, much shorter period, and you're constrained to that because of how we handle debt. And it's just really frustrating when you look both to New Zealand's history on how we funded and financed infrastructure with special purpose debt vehicles tied to the revenue that was enabled by a new piece of infrastructure, spreading the cost over long periods of time. Like a century ago, New Zealand totally did this, and it worked. And if you look abroad to the United States right now, it still runs that way, right? The kinds of general obligation debt that councils here take on as a matter of course, that's the only debt that we have. Well, that's a minority of U.S. debt. Something like 68%. There's, I think it was Moody's that had the numbers earlier this year when I'd been checking into this. Something like 68% of U.S. municipal debt is special purpose debt. Revenue bonds of the kind that I've been talking about that are ring-fenced for a special purpose, where it's the revenues from the project that finance the bond over time. A really simple example. Albany, New York is smaller than Dunedin. It's the capital of New York State, but it's a tiny little town. And tiny little town of Albany, it has its own parking authority, the Albany City Parking Authority. A couple decades ago, the Albany City Parking Authority issued a bond. It set up a bond issue where they went out to market and said, buy our bonds and we'll pay you interest over time. Where do the revenues from that bond come from? The revenues of the Albany Parking Authority. They used the money to put up a new parking garage, and they paid off the debt by parking charges in the parking garage over the next 20 years. Right? Like, it totally makes sense. It's user pays. It's not trying to make everybody else in town pay for the thing who aren't using it. And because they're taking that debt to market, you get a commercial assessment of whether the parking lot even makes sense in the first place. Because who is going to buy that debt if they think that the revenues from the Albany City Parking Authority are not going to be sufficient to pay off the bond over time? If you think that the project's a dud, then you're going to say, well, the only way I'm lending to you is if it's at like a crazy high interest rate because you're really risky. If you wind up in that spot, that's really useful information, right? It tells you something you didn't know before. It says, my God, we thought this project made a lot of sense, but now they're telling us that it's incredibly risky. Maybe we should think about this again. We don't really have that check here. Right?
Okay, so before we run out of time, I want to get on to how you think we should do this, what policy people should look for from their parties, and then I also want to look into just what political parties are saying on their websites, and I also want to touch on Three Waters.
Sure, yeah.
But before we even do that, the obvious question is, what if you want to put in a sidewalk somewhere or a biking trail that doesn't have a clear, revenue generating stream of revenue generated by it?
Oh, well, you can always set a special levy, right? So if you look back historically, the sewerage and pipes in one of the wards of Avondale. I've been looking at the bond issuance from this. I think it was 1928, or maybe 26. They just set a levy on the properties that were going to be benefited by it, right? So if you're talking about sidewalks and paths, I can imagine. Okay, again, back to my neighborhood. There's one of the roads that actually doesn't have paths. On one side, it'd be very nice to have paths on that. If somebody put up a proposal saying, hey, it's going to cost us $100,000 to build the sidewalk on this side of the road so that kids don't have to cross the street in unsafe ways, they can walk on the other side of the road and get to school, and it's a lot easier. Would you be willing to pay a small increment on your rates over the next 30 years to pay for this path? I'd say, hell yes! Right? Okay? It's not like you have to stand there charging people to walk on the sidewalk. All of the adjacent property owners benefit from it, and if you don't require them to pay it off immediately, but can set a small annual levy until the thing is paid off and have long-term debt, easy.
Okay, thanks. That answers that question. So, on to the next one. Let's quickly look at Three Waters, because this is massive, because I'm beginning to understand why Three Waters makes sense and why people are frustrated by it at the same time. It's almost as if there was a time when this could have been managed by councils, but with the way that councils have evolved, and my understanding is that water is most of what councils do, or maybe that's overstating it, but maybe the overstatement kind of paints the right picture. And now you've got, say, Hawke's Bay that can't manage its water. I'm sure there are some councils there that can, but there's one town that until recently, or maybe still does, was discharging its sewage into the Tuki River. You had the Campylobacter poisoning outbreak in Havelock that poisoned 5,500 people. 4 people died, and that's tragic. But for the scale of it, it was, what was profound to me to see that happen was to see it. It was like a biblical plague, and just the effect that had on the people who lived there, the sense of uncertainty and the lack of a sense of security that people had when suddenly they can't trust the water coming out of their tap, and they and all of their neighbours and their kids are all sick. I mean, it really demonstrates. And then Wellington can't manage its own water. Let's rehash exactly what has gone wrong there and why the Three Waters approach makes sense and what the actual change looks like with Three Waters as quickly as possible.
All right. I'm not entirely sure that Three Waters makes sense, but we'll step back a little bit and unpack those problems. There are 2 separate issues to what you were talking about. One of them is a health and safety issue. The other one is capacity and competence in delivering water infrastructure. So let's deal with the health and safety one first. Ministry of Health had traditionally been the ones who were set as the water regulator on water quality. They were supposed to be going in and doing the proper inspections, making sure that water was up to spec and safe to use. They failed in that regularly. They weren't really doing the inspection that they were supposed to have been doing, and that's one reason that Labour shifted to having a new water quality regulator. That passed a couple of years ago. That is its own thing, regardless of what happens with Three Waters. If the Three Waters program goes ahead, or if it's scrapped, we will still have a new central government water quality regulator that will be making sure that water is safe. Okay? So 2 separate issues. Now, it could be the case that it is easier to comply with the water quality regulations coming out of the new water quality regulator with amalgamated entities, but it might not be. So we'll leave the safety issue to one side, not because it's not important, but because it really doesn't have much to do with Three Waters on its own. It's already been handled by a separate regulatory intervention. It's got a new agency that's established that's going to be handling that. So we'll leave that there. On the Three Waters reform side. So I'd previously talked about these infrastructure funding and financing constraints and how difficult it is for councils to lay out infrastructure. So Three Waters was one way to try and get around that problem. Now, a lot of the rhetoric around it has been around that water safety issue, which has nothing to do with it because it's being dealt with by its own water quality regulator.
Well, there you go.
But
yeah.
yeah. But a lot of the comms on it has been entirely about an issue that's already been dealt with, that has nothing really to do with Three Waters reform. And it's especially frustrating. Like, you go into select committee and you're talking about the Three Waters stuff, and if you question some of it, there's a Labour member on the committee that gave me heck for it. She said, well, we had Havelock North. Do you want people to die? Like, but you guys just set a new water quality regulator, and like, that was Labour that set that. Do you not trust your new water quality regulator that you just established and voted for? Like, what's going on here? Entirely separate things. Anyway, the idea was that if you take it off of councils and unlock some debt carrying capacity by these new water companies so that they can issue debt to fund the infrastructure over time, then you get away from council's balance sheet limits. And that's one of the reasons that you got into all of these messes around governance. So the co-governance arrangements wound up being really controversial and pissing a lot of people off. I'm agnostic on that side, but some of that was designed to try to separate councils from the water companies so that it was less likely that if something went wrong, council would bail out the water company. So the more that they could do to make it separate, the more confidence a bond rating agency might have that council debt was its own thing, water agency debt was its own thing, and if the water quality if the water companies went under or had difficulties in debt financing, it wasn't going to affect council main balance sheet debt. Because if it did, then it would just count against council's main balance sheet limit, and you wouldn't have solved any of the problem. You would still be stuck with water companies not being able to have access to funding and financing. So that was one of the things that they were trying to set there in these convoluted governance structures. It was partially an attempt to get balance sheet separation by severing the direct links between the councils and the water companies.
This is absolutely not my understanding of Three Waters whatsoever.
The government has figured that councils are not particularly competent in this and that there are efficiencies in mergers. They know that there's a balance sheet constraint, and they wanted to make sure that there's going to be separation of the balance sheet so that the new water companies would be able to access funding and financing. And demonstrably, there's been problems, right? So some of the cases that you were citing on water being discharged out to rivers, I had a couple of reports a few years ago looking at water quality issues, and just kind of frustrated that it's right to get mad at farmers for some of the water quality issues in rivers, but townies wind up having water treatment plants in the central North Island that are just discharging to rivers. They're getting outside of their consents, and nobody does much about it, right? So townies seem to get a free pass for dumping their own crap in the rivers, and then everybody gets mad at the farmer. Like, we should try and get mad at both equally, or in equal proportion. Anyway, if the real underlying problem is a balance sheet issue, that's something that you can deal with the kind of revenue bond structure that I talked about earlier. You don't have to amalgamate the water authorities to do it. All you need to do is enable councils or council-controlled entities like a water company to issue debt that is structurally separated from council's main balance sheet. If a water company could issue debt that is backed only by the revenues of the council-owned water company, like, this isn't a privatization thing, this is just, like, we've got council-controlled organizations all over the place. A water company can be a council-controlled organization. It just needs to make sure that debt that's issued by it is only backed by revenues from the water company, which would be charges on users, volumetric charges or connection charges, or a rate. Be flexible in how you set it. So long as that debt is serviced by its own separate set of revenues and isn't going to call on council to bail it out, they're separate things. And then that infrastructure can be funded through decades-long bonds that are financed by payments over those decades from the eventual users of the kit. Now, we do have a new water quality regulator, and if the combination of a water quality regulator and compliance cost pressure from central government saying, well, look, you're not going to be allowed to keep dumping stuff in the rivers anymore. You have to meet water quality standards, both for intake and delivered serviced water, but also for the stuff that gets dumped out afterwards. If that makes it too costly for a council to be able to handle on its own, that would give them incentive to merge together in cases where it made sense to do so. So one of the worries that we've had is that some of the promised benefits of amalgamation, well, like, they were looking at the Scottish model where you had parts of the country where you had overlapping pipes and stuff. Here, it's all really geographically dispersed. You're not going to be getting the same kind of savings that they'd be getting out of Scotland. And you could probably just solve the problem through revenue bonds for water combined with tight enforcement by the water quality regulator.
So this is interesting because, a big theme in the conversation we've just been having is the restriction on essentially council funding, right? Councils do not have a whole lot of money. And when I was reading National's website, which says virtually nothing, none of the actual major parties' websites say anything really about what their policies are. They just say, all they say is we're going to force councils to ring fence funds, which is not a policy. It says they're going to make life harder for councils. It doesn't say they're going to help them in any way. And presumably all of that money gets taken away from cleaning, the town centre and collecting rubbish and stuff like that. Essentially making life harder for them. But what you're telling me is that the real problem or the real solution is facilitating the financing of this development through debt and paying that debt off via a levy.
Yep. And be flexible on what the levy is. It can be volumetric charges in places where that makes sense. It could be user fees. It could be a special purpose tax district where if it's authorized by the ratepayers in that area where they say, yes, this is a good project and we are willing to pay a bit more on our rates over the next 30 years to cover the cost of the thing, make sure that you have that ratepayer authorization structure on it to block projects that just don't make much sense, because otherwise you wind up skewing the pitch across all of it, right? If ratepayers see that this is just a mechanism for facilitating even higher levels of council debt, funding things that they don't much like, well, then you're all going to find new ways for ratepayers to try and block councils from accessing debt, and you're back at where you were before. I really like that ratepayer authorization mechanism as one check against bad projects. I also like debt going to market based on the revenues that are promised from the project as another commercial test to make sure whether the business case that council thinks it's had for a project actually really stacks up, because it's really easy for councils or others to delude themselves on it, right? And the same thing is true in private markets. If you've got a startup and you think that it's world beating and you go out to market and all of the potential investors tell you that it's crap or that they'll only invest for a massive share of the equity in it, well, maybe it's not as good as you thought. And maybe they know something that you didn't know, right? Because they've got experience judging across lots of these kinds of projects. That's useful information to bring in that we otherwise don't have access to.
Okay, so, Three Waters is essentially all I can find about Labor's plans to support local governments on extending, on expanding their infrastructure, greenfields or otherwise. The other, all right, we've discussed National, which say virtually nothing as well, and it's interesting that they don't. I think there's actually a reason why they don't say very much on the website. I think they're trying to avoid putting anything out there so the opposition can rip them to pieces. Especially when we think about how totally misunderstood Three Waters is, certainly from my perspective anyway. ACT is probably the one that has the most to say. And they say they'll share 50% of the GST revenue from new residential buildings with councils. They'll restrict the right to object to neighbours who are directly affected by a project, and allow neighbourhoods to vote to exempt themselves from any planning rules, reduce the need for consents where infrastructure projects use a code of practice to manage environmental effects. To what degree are these creative? To what degree are these reforms that we can expect to happen in a matter of due course?
Sure. So I'm not sure if it's currently national policy, but they have previously pitched it. They proposed, rather than a checkoff from GST going back to councils with each new house, a lump sum transfer. So for every house that is consented and built in a council's area, I can't remember the amount of money, but there'd be a lump sum that would go back to council to try and encourage them to facilitate development, which is it's better than we have had. ACT's policy on that with GST sharing is tied to the value of the new building. The per unit payment that National had previously talked about would achieve something pretty similar. But they're still fairly minor in the grand scheme of things. I'm not sure that they would quite do as much as needed to move the dial for councils in being more accommodative or more enabling of growth. I think still that we need a combination of approaches. So Labor's urban growth agenda did focus on constraints against councils doing stuff that was blocking growth. I think that it'd be a good idea to maintain a lot of those kinds of constraints, at least as a medium-term thing, while providing councils far better incentives. So if you fix infrastructure funding and financing so that it's easier for councils to say yes, because the beneficiaries of projects are the ones who pay for them over time, it's not something that councillors have to worry about or that gets spread across their other parts of the town, that makes it easier to say yes. Giving them a more substantial share of, like, if central government gets a lot more income tax revenue, company tax revenue, and GST when councils grow, why not punt some of that back to councils so that councils share in that growth and have incentives that are aligned with central government, so that when central government's revenues go up, local government's revenues go up as well for things that that council has helped achieve. So getting those incentives aligned would be pretty good. But because we've had bad incentives over decades, there have been cultures that have built up within councils that are pretty antithetical to enabling growth. And that's some of the stuff that you were talking about in Act's policy of getting rid of some of these constraints, forcing councils to be more enabling. Well, that culture takes a long time to change. You'll need some of those kinds of guardrails, like NPSUD from the Labour government or the medium density rules, or an option that I have liked, which would trigger more land supply whenever the price differential gets too high. So you could require that councils zone for more land whenever housing is too expensive relative to median household income. So internationally, if the median house is around the price of the median house is about 3-4 times median household income, that's considered like affordable housing. Here it's more like 9 or 10. You could have pretty sharp constraints banning a lot of the restrictions on development if housing is very expensive in a council's area, but then easing those back if councils have been able to come up with measures that have made housing affordable. Similarly, at city fringes, right now, Auckland has proposed a set of restrictions on new development at city fringes, but land that's zoned just inside of Auckland's boundary is 4 times the price of land that's just outside of Auckland's boundary. You could set a rule that if the land is more than twice as expensive as bare paddock costs, after accounting for land development costs, that council must allow more new subdivisions and must allow private plan changes that would enable more suburban growth. Because if you did that, then competition from those fringe developments would help keep land prices down across the rest of the urban gradient. So I like that kind of combination. Set price kinds of triggers for requiring councils to enable more development, provide them incentives so that they want to encourage more development, and then those work together, that the incentives are aligned for councils to want more development, and because it'll take some time for those cultures to change, you've got the guardrails on it that's requiring them to act in accordance with those incentives until the cultures change. And then you don't have to tell them what to do anymore. They just go on with it.
Poor councils. I mean, they just seem totally vilified by this entire atmosphere.
Well, at every turn, it's a self-reinforcing, terrible equilibrium, right? So central government tends to view councils as being a bunch of muppets that can't be trusted with anything. So they set more mandates on local councils that make it more difficult for people to work in council. They take responsibilities away from local councils, which mean, like, if you want to make a big difference for your community, like, why would you even consider going to work for council compared to other parts of government where you might have more chance of affecting change? Now, like, that's terrible, because the places where you can really affect meaningful improvements to living conditions is by zoning more liberally so that we can get out of this housing crisis. But councils don't really have flexibility to do that because they can't fund and finance it. And because they don't share in the benefits from it, they'll get hammered by local residents for the cost that they perceive from it. And you don't have ability to provide other amenities to make life better for them. So it's kind of a hiding to nowhere. So central government sees councils as idiots, so they take responsibility and power away, which makes councils lose capacity, which makes central government see them as even bigger idiots, and it just kind of snowballs. You need to get out of that loop and enable councils that are innovative, willing to take the punt to do that, give them the tools to do it properly, and then set up self-reinforcing mechanisms so that the councils that are successful in this see the extra revenues that come from it, that helps them build more capacity, make it more attractive to work in council. Like, you can get into a more virtuous cycle there.
Okay, well, I mean, I think that wraps it up. I mean, I had no idea about anything that you've just described about these issues with debt financing. I mean, to be honest, it's not a subject that I've had an opinion on. It's just one that I've really wanted to try and understand. And I feel like I've got more questions now than I began with, mostly because maybe that is what it means to have some degree of understanding of a subject.
Well, I'll give one really simple, concrete example of how New Zealand used to be able to get things done and really should be able to again before we sign off. Again, near where I live, I'm Candela. Nio is the next little village over on the other direction from Johnsonville. In the early 1920s, the Nio Progressive Residents Association decided that they wanted to have a town hall. They didn't go begging to Wellington Council for a town hall, like we did for Candela just did for a swimming pool upgrade. Instead, the Residents Association had a ballot of their local members, right? The people who live in the area. Would you be willing over the next 10 years to pay a special levy on your properties to cover the cost of this hall? And they said yes. So the Progressive Residents Association, which is just this private outfit, right? It's a voluntary community organization that saw something that needed to be done that their community wanted. They went to council and said, look, people here are happy to pay an extra levy to finance the debt that would build this hall. Can we do this? And then council said, sure, right? So you set the special levy on those properties and the town hall gets built in 2 years and it still stands today. My kids did some of their lessons there. Communities could self-organize for this stuff when you had the capacity to debt finance it properly. And all council had to do was administer the special ratings area. We could get back to that if we had these kinds of mechanisms again, but we've lost it all.
Well, then again, thanks so much, Eric. That at least gives us a way to move forward.
Thank you. Been a lot of fun.
Great. Economic policies tend to get politicized. Regulation is often associated with the left and deregulation with the right. In this way, sensible policy can often be discarded not for rational or even ideological reasons, but simply because of its association with one philosophical view or another. It's interesting to hear a representative of the economic perspective we associate with the political right in New Zealand advocating for infrastructure development, like rail, which we might associate with the political left. There are objections that can be raised to using special purpose debt vehicles to fund public infrastructure. The most powerful argument that comes to mind is that this is a slippery slope to privatizing the infrastructure itself. This is always a valid concern, but it's separate from the solution Eric is proposing. Every change is a slope in some direction, and every slope is slippery. There is also a potential issue with individuals in lower income municipalities lacking the funds to pay for the development of their own infrastructure. Eric indicated that income redistribution might make up at least part of the solution, and this is the domain of central government. Income redistribution is a fancy phrase that might refer to progressive taxation, social welfare, or infrastructure funding support for underdeveloped neighbourhoods and regions. The role of central government control or oversight is to smooth over the bumps of imperfect policy, and all policy is imperfect. Next week, we have Hugh Parsons of Burl, one of the nation's largest think tanks, discussing the emissions trading scheme. That's all for now. Thanks for listening or watching. Find this on both YouTube and Spotify. Just search Aotearoa Tomorrow. Please like, share, subscribe, send me comments, the works. Cheers.